The fan criticism surrounding the Star Wars sequels has had Disney reeling, despite them making over the billion mark on the box office with every sequel offering so far. The Force Awakens has made over $2 billion, The Last Jedi over $1.3 billion, and The Rise of Skywalker making just over $1 billion at the time of writing. It's obvious that there's been a dramatic drop-off in return since the return of Star Wars, and Solo ushered in the unthinkable with an actual loss that put the iron rod through the spokes of Disney's plans for the future. The combination of fan expectations, a studio-led political agenda, once again aggravated with public antagonism of the critical fans, and an apparent lack of understanding of the established cinematic universe has resulted in a lot of ill feeling, which has been primed and stoked by other disastrous reboot endeavours like Ghostbusters 2016. This, along with an utter lack of regard for the roadmap for the story, has left Star Wars in an unhappy place. Where does Star Wars go from here? That's the literal multi-billion-dollar question. I'll largely ignore the TV side of things as I'm not willing to subscribe to Disney Plus under any circumstances. I have ethical and practical problems with this corporate subscription culture, where such a small amount of what they offer is of interest to me, yet I still have to pay for all of it. If I'm told anything by the current direction that many of the TV series are taking, most notably Star Trek and Doctor Who at the moment, it's that I'm not wanted. Fine, fuck you very much. I'll keep my money for the DVDs, and if they don't come, too bad. From what I understand, The Mandalorian is decent enough. I have to say the reviews seem rather cool, erring on the side of it's better than the sequel films rather than it being outright it's amazing. We have had a couple of standalone films as well. Solo, despite the backlash that it got, was okay. Not much more than that, it has to be said, but it kind of did its thing okay. It was a bit ponderous, it looked a bit drab, and its lead character wasn't exactly a young Harrison Ford, but it was okay. Problem is that okay is not good enough for a story involving one of the most beloved characters from the OT, and it was only somewhat less bland than a Luke backstory where we get to see his days farming moisture on Tatooine. In my opinion, it still worked better than The Last Jedi at the end of the day, and it got an unfairly brutal reception in some respects, one that was in no small part fueled by the backlash to The Last Jedi. But we did get Rogue One, which, as redundant as it may be, was an interesting film on a few levels, being more down and dirty than any of the previous Star Wars films to date. Standalone films seem to me to be one of the ways forward. Films with a smaller scope, more character-based, lower budget, you can take risks with content and cater to smaller, more specific audiences. When it comes to the main series, I do wonder if there are really legs on the idea of yet another Empire against the Rebels story. The question is, what else is there? It's Star Wars, it's kind of in the name as to what the main feature of the story is going to be. Musing on the potential scope of the Star Wars universe aside, George Lucas had left enough rough notes on where he saw Star Wars going, and to me at least, it seems very typical of Lucas's rather wild and messy imagination. But first, before I go on, a word of warning, a trigger warning if you like. I know this is going to seem like a hit job on Lucas, and I don't intend to offend your feelings about the man who created Star Wars, but I am going to set up the case against Lucas not being involved in Star Wars to any great extent going forward, and that means criticising a man for who I have divided feelings about. On one hand, he's been a magnificent force for advancement in technology and behind-the-scenes processes in film. His contribution to the technical side of cinema is truly magnificent, and I think pretty much unparalleled by any other single person, what with THX Sound and Industrial Light and Magic being amongst the jewels in his crown. I consider technical work in the arts to be capable of being as much an art form as what the directors, writers and actors do, and in this respect Lucas is deserving of great praise and appreciation. On the other hand, however, when it comes to what's known in the industry as the creative side, these things directly related to performance, the audience experience, and the story that they are delivered, I can't help but feel that Lucas is at best mediocre, save for when he cedes the final creative control to someone who can tell his stories in a more disciplined, comprehensible, and just plain human way. It's not that Lucas can't tell a story, it's that he seemingly can't tell one without getting bogged down in detail, and be distracted by irrelevancies that are interesting to him, but most often only to him. When it comes to Star Wars, the evolving exploration of what the Force is probably one of the more important examples to give, certainly to the story side of things. Lucas has played with this aspect of the Star Wars world for quite some time, with the prequel trilogy introducing the midichlorians into what was presented as a purely spiritual phenomenon in the OT. The Force shifted from being a magical thing to being something akin to a symbiotic bacterial infection. This in turn has been furthered with the introduction of the Wills, a microbiotic being that feeds on the Force that is manipulated by them, using the midichlorians to control the universe, using living things as vehicles for them to travel around in, while creating certain destinies for them to presumably further the Force, on which they feed all the while. As Lucas apparently says, the Wills were the Force in a general sense. I don't know, man, it sounds like they're eating themselves. The idea certainly is, it's just utter gobbledygook. I can't swear to the accuracy of this interpretation. This largely comes from some reading into it on Wikipedia, a fan-based website that would presumably have more insight into the wider Star Wars world than I do. But this is part of the problem with Lucas and his writings. Not only does he have wild ideas, they change significantly every time he returns to them, and they just don't plug together well. This is all very characteristic to Lucas's writing, not just from the time of the prequels trilogy, even as far back as the original Star Wars. As I said before in the first part of this Star Wars special of the OT, the original cut of Star Wars was pretty awful. The scenes introducing Luke were significantly longer and astoundingly pointless, coupled with Lucas's editing, which broke up the tension of what was going on the Rebel ship, and with the escape of the droids. It killed the pacing at a point where it desperately needed to draw the audience in. The film was subsequently saved by the work of those around him, and while he remained involved and active in the film's reworking, he never really seemed to learn from that experience, as when he had full control again with the prequels, he went right back to making the same kind of mistakes, only this time there was no one around to tell him no. George Lucas is just not a writer of any great skill. Aside from the general structure, outside of the classic storytelling techniques, he has too wild and unfocused an approach to make a streamlined and efficient story. He's famous for his last-minute script completion, and I honestly think he hates that part of the job. And then there's the dialogue. Oh God, the dialogue. As Harrison Ford famously said to George, "You can type this shit, but you can't say it." Lucas has had his characters speak in his writing voice. I actually feel for him, as I all too often write exactly how I think. It often doesn't translate to what's comfortable or even possible to reproduce using human language. The difference is I tend to correct for it in the reading and don't inflict that upon others to perform. When Lucas was responsible for the majority of the writing for the prequels, we got treated to some Tommy Wiseau levels of language bilge. A thought occurred to me when I began to hear some fans, including some prominent publicly critical fans, expressing a desire for Lucas to return to helm Star Wars once again. And that thought was this: I feel for the prequels exactly how you feel about the sequels. How would you feel if fans of the sequel trilogy in years to come were to call for the return of Abrams or Johnson? A parallel to the Star Wars creator adoration can also be found in Star Trek. Roddenberry's overwatch of Star Trek was characterised most damningly by the next-gen episode The Bonding. The episode itself is a shining example of how the original creator of a beloved piece of fiction can, even with the best intentions, become a problem for it going forward. The problem here was the Roddenberry box. The box, for those not in the know, was the confining rules for Star Trek writers, a set of rules that Roddenberry used to define and preserve his vision of humanity in Star Trek. To quote Michael Piller in the unreleased book Fade In, Roddenberry was adamant that 24th century man would evolve past petty emotional turmoil that gets in the way of our happiness today. Well, as any writer will tell you, emotional turmoil, petty and otherwise, is at the core of any good drama. It creates conflict between the characters, but Gene didn't want conflict between our characters. All the problems of mankind have been solved, he said. Earth is a paradise. Now go write drama. While Pillar approached this as a positive challenge, it's fairly clear that for all the good intent and indeed for all the creativity it pulled from the writers to work within the box, it was definitely a roadblock to an awful lot of great ideas, and forced characters like the boy in the Bonding to seem astonishingly alien, barely human at all. Roddenberry's box had its uses, but it also killed a lot of drama. Arguably one of the best Star Trek series, at least the one with the most interesting ideas, came out of the years after Roddenberry's death, and I wonder what it would have looked like had Roddenberry himself still been at the helm. Deep Space Nine had conflict between the main characters and the aligned characters. Humans can be bad guys and Starfleet wasn't always right, even morally. It wasn't, and possibly still isn't, thought of as fondly as TNG or TOS, but it certainly delivered a more rich and interesting story, and had a long game that kept even the most inevitable lulls bearable. This is not to crap on Roddenberry or his rules, but relaxing the box while still striving to respect its ethos allowed for some great television. Thankfully, Roddenberry's ticks in the win column were significantly greater than the crosses. But still. When it comes to George Lucas, I can't help but feel that unlike where Roddenberry's box was overly strict but with specific intent, Lucas talks of rules and law but doesn't really respect either himself. That's the right of the original creator, some may say, but it doesn't bode well for the fictional world's future. Especially when the creator has an epic track record of wildly veering his way to a story while refusing to allow ideas to die, no matter how bizarre or ill-fitting they may be. Where Roddenberry had his box, Lucas had a meandering highway with constantly switching destinations. Now this doesn't mean that everything he writes is bad. He clearly has many, many great ideas, but it all goes in, everything he can get away with, and without much of a filter. It's unfortunate and admittedly a little charming from a point of view that Lucas is like a kid with a toy when it comes to his most prominent work. But for all his enthusiasm for the ideas, there's an overconfidence in his own ability to guide the story in a way that keeps it focused and interesting, and an apparent lack of desire to please anyone other than himself. Now, I'm not saying he has to pander to the fans. Innovation is often a good thing, but Lucas certainly doesn't seem to want to play with his audience at all, and I'm not even sure he knows what audience he's playing to. Does that sound familiar? The prequels are in many respects very different from each other in terms of tone. The first being largely very frivolous, the second was focusing very heavily on much more adult-level politics while having cartoon villains, and the third, that was getting quite dark and twisting the central character from being a heroic type to a child murderer, while his love interest pretty much brushes off his murderous activity as being understandable. The three films split their attention across so many threads as well, wildly different purposes to all of them. It was a cacophony of jarring notes of humour that clashed with the drama, and it all ended up being a bloated mess with only a few elements that worked as a story. Those parts, admittedly, did work quite nicely though. His demands that he has total artistic control in his projects, as he would in the new Star Wars project, would likely mean that once again we'll find all the same lack of self-control will come flooding back, as he throws piles of money at making his vision as whole as he can. It happened with the prequels. Lucas's career-long struggle with dialogue also suggests issues with his writing in general. He doesn't write to communicate character, he's writing to exposit. This is a terrible betrayal of not just the audience and the actors, it's a betrayal of the characters. They are there to spew out the plot points. I have no doubt that he's a man of vision, though very often it's expressed by representing other people's ideas. He spends so much time on his inner monologue that he's not enough of a team player to allow others to express themselves. This is most prominent in the way that he directs actors, particularly in the prequels. His lack of love for dialogue really hampers the performer's art, making them puppets to his puppeteer, and while some directors may get away with this, with Lucas we find his actors end up looking stiff and bereft of inspiration as they force out unwieldy dialogue surrounded by walls of green screens. He's just not an actor's director, and again, the original work cut of Star Wars shows major issues with his ability to commit his mental vision to celluloid. He just can't join the ideas up very well. This is apparent in the prequels, where Lucas just couldn't bring himself to reject extraneous ideas, and this was to the point that he seemed to realise at times that he'd swamped himself down by planting key plot points in scenes that he knew should probably go. There are so many ideas, but navigating between or away from them has always seemingly been a problem for him. Not that that will stop him adding more, as and when he wants. Lucas has never felt that his films were ever finished, be it THX 1138, where the original cut has been removed from availability in favour of his director's cut, or the OT Star Wars, which Lucas has tinkered with, or in my opinion systematically vandalised since its release, with an active effort to remove the original versions completely. He has had no respect for the experience that the audience has had with his films. When Steven Spielberg altered his classic film E.T., there was an outcry from the fans. But do you know what he did? He thought about that response, and he publicly renounced the changes that he made, promising not to do it again. He saw the error of his ways, and the film was restored for the home media versions. In the meantime, what was Lucas doing? More changes. The special edition had awful extra shots put in, including an entirely pointless extended Mos Eisley approach scene, where more monsters were digitally inserted, and most infamously, the reinsertion of a scene of entirely no consequence, where Han Solo meets with Jabba the Hutt. Why? Because Lucas couldn't let it go. It was his idea, and in his head, the film was incomplete without it. It didn't matter that it didn't add anything. It didn't matter that he had to do very strange things with the visuals to make it functional. It didn't matter that no one had missed it in the first place, or that it just plain doesn't work in context of where it sits in a movie, or that it messes with the value and impact of a couple of other far more important scenes. Lucas wanted it. Therefore, it went in. This is the shittiest kind of film direction. That scene has since been rejigged on at least one occasion, and it still looks like crap, while not matching our original introduction to Jabba in Return of the Jedi. To what end? The scene does not need to exist. It looks awful, doesn't match the later film, and adds nothing to the film itself. This is just one of those blatant examples of Lucas not being able to identify important stuff in a film. It all goes in. And then there's the Han shoots Greedo scene, which has been changed time after time after time, including going so far as to manipulate Han's head to partially detach to avoid Greedo's now provocative blast. All because we're supposed to be of the opinion that Han Solo, the space pirate guy, the guy who's on the run and being extorted at gunpoint with a dead or alive bounty on his head, the scoundrel, wouldn't be so cold as to shoot first. Lucas has been very insistent on this change, with it being one of the longest standing and most revisited changes, and that's along with the episode 4 conceit that meant we had to have 3 full movies made in order to line things up, no matter what the cost. Aside from our half-arsed Laserdisc ripped optional extra on a now deleted DVD release, the fans have not been able to get the original versions of those films, only the special editions, with whatever changes Lucas has made since. The infamous last word of Greedo that wormed its way into the Disney Plus edition is both ridiculous and tragic. His final perplexing utterance of McClunky seems to have come from one of Lucas's final changes to the film before he sold it to Disney, and stems from the prequels. Of course it does. Now, it's not that I'm opposed to all changes in the film. The upscaling, the restoration work, the tidying up of the failings in the special effects like the optical transparencies of the snowspeeder cockpits, those things vary in importance but are fine to me. The messing with what the images show, though, the addition of extra material and tinkering with scenes and all that superfluous stuff while making the original cut unavailable as possible, that's unforgivable. He would likely destroy every single copy of the original versions if he could, like he would with the holiday special, and it must tear him apart that the Library of Congress not only has the original version, but has apparently restored it. This behaviour leads me to one conclusion, that George Lucas does not respect the fans at all. The films he made, he feels are his and his alone to do with as he pleases. Legally, this is true, at least until Disney bought it up, Morally, though, not so much in my opinion. And I do wonder if Disney have even the right to re-release the original cuts, or if Lucas has a provision to keep them buried in the contract that he's signed. I'd bet good money that's the case. For all the justified cries that Disney doesn't care about the Star Wars fans, for Lucas the fans don't count for anything either. The other creative forces in the making of the film, they don't matter. The people that want and love the original, well, he knows better. The movies are his to play with, and screw anybody else who would like to have the movie that they actually fell in love with originally. Does that sound familiar? George Lucas returning to helm Star Wars would not only be affirmation for the man who has done his best to raise the thing that we fell in love with back in the day, it would also lead to another huge disappointment after our initial pro-Lucas fan adoration dies down. And that adoration would eventually subside into slowly dawning horror at the decisions that he made. If he gets Star Wars back, you may as well kiss goodbye to the original cut release, well, forever. In fact, expect more changes to it. And expect Rian Johnson levels of reimagining of the Star Wars universe with convoluted and nonsensical tripe like the Wills being left out to the extended universe to try to make sense of. It will be a guaranteed self-indulgent garish mess that doesn't like the existing fans of the prequels, or the OT, or the sequels. I've said of the sequels that the detractors of those feel exactly how I feel about the prequels. Now ask yourself, do you want Lucas to take up the mantle of Rian Johnson? Because he will change Star Wars. He will subvert that universe into what he wants it to be at this point, and it will be at the fans' expense. He's already done it once, and he's tried his hardest to erase the past, to make it inaccessible to the fans of whatever trilogy. Disney surely have fucked things up. I fully agree. They fucked it up really badly. But Lucas isn't the way forward. For all the things that I wholly respect him for, his technological innovation, his involvement with the extended world outside the films, his contribution to filmmaking and the creation of the Star Wars universe itself, it's his bullish attitude towards the films that lead to actual harm being visited upon his movies. It just makes me resent every word he says. It makes me distrust his opinion on the matter. It makes me fiercely question his competence as an artistic contributor when he's all too willing to vandalise his own work to suit his whims, and he doesn't seem to play well with others on a creative level either. If he could, then I'd be happy to see him come back as an advisory role, but I don't think he'd settle for anything short of absolute control, and we've seen what that looks like. Disney didn't kill Star Wars, they just dropped the ball really badly. George Lucas, however, has been doing just that since he started recutting the OT, and then when he made the prequels, and he would do more if and when he can. He isn't going to bring it back. He's just going to continue to take it away. Just as way of a little bit of a coda, yeah, I got a bit salty in this. Like I say, no offence is intended, not even to Lucas himself really. As someone who fell in love with the OT, it being the first piece of cinema that I ever fell in love with, that's not an easy thing to criticise so harshly the creator of that work. I do so because I love to see Star Wars be amazing again. I want to see a new generation get what I got back in the late 70s. An experience that stayed with me for over 40 years. Unfortunately, Lucas has shown that he's neither capable nor willing to do that, and as bad as Disney dropped the ball and stabbed it until it'd make a serial killer cry for them to stop, there was for many OT fans a glimmer of hope, until Johnson ironically did exactly what Lucas has been doing for years and decided to please himself. Fortunately, now that Lucasfilm has had its head rammed so far up its own arse that earwax is the only thing it's capable of tasting, and Disney are hunkering down in the trenches, it looks unlikely that we'll see much of note for a very long time. So yeah, I'm angry. Still. Many folks really like the prequels and no one should take that away from you, but like I say, I feel about the prequels exactly how you feel about the sequels. I feel about George Lucas exactly the same things you feel about Rian Johnson. In my opinion, they're equally broken, just in different ways. Hopefully as fans we can find a way forward and pressure those in charge to give Star Wars the return it deserves. Something that is for the fans, but that will also welcome new fans with good writing, great characters, and a lot of cool shit going on screen. It doesn't have to be a mind-bogglingly expensive budget. The first one was very modest. It doesn't have to be a masterpiece. The first one wasn't. It just needs to be engaging. It needs to be fun and show a love for the universe that so many have already fallen in love with. Good characters, a well-crafted story, and exciting filmmaking. Back to basics, really. One can only dream.